So here's a headline that should be getting a lot more attention than it currently is. Right now, sitting somewhere between 190 and 240 million computers on this planet are physically, permanently incapable of ever running Windows 11. Not unlikely to, would need an upgrade. Incapable, locked out by hardware, forever, no matter what you do. And a lot of you watching this right now own one of those machines and have no idea. Let's do the timeline honestly, because there's been a lot of confusion around this, and I want you to actually understand where things stand today, not where a headline from 18 months ago said they'd stand. Windows 10 officially reached end of support on October 14th, 2025. That date already happened. If you're still on Windows 10 and you didn't do anything about it, you've technically been running an unsupported operating system for the better part of a year now. Then, back in June of this year, Microsoft did something quiet. And I mean genuinely quiet. Not a press conference, not a keynote, just a support page that got updated and an editor's note slipped into an old blog post. They extended the free consumer security update program, which was originally supposed to cut off in October 2026, all the way out to October 12th, 2027. One more full year of free protection, just like that, almost buried. On the surface, that sounds like good news. And for a lot of people, in the short term, it genuinely is. It buys breathing room. But here's what that extension does not fix, and this is the entire point of this video. It does not touch the actual wall that's causing this crisis in the first place. Because the problem was never really about a calendar date. The problem is a hardware requirement, and hardware requirements don't get extended by a blog post. To run Windows 11, Microsoft requires something called TPM 2.0, Trusted Platform Module, version 2, plus an 8th generation Intel processor, or newer, or an AMD Ryzen 2000 series chip, or newer. If your machine doesn't have that, Windows 11 doesn't install. It's not a warning message you can click past. It's not a proceed at your own risk screen. The installer simply refuses, full stop. And the machines getting refused are not ancient. We're talking about laptops and desktops built between roughly 2015 and 2019. 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. Machines that right now, today, in July 2026, still open fine, run fine, browse the internet, handle video calls, manage email, do everything a normal person actually needs a computer to do. Analysts at Canalys put the number of PCs excluded purely because of this hardware wall at around 240 million. Not slow computers, not broken computers. Computers that are just slightly too old for a line Microsoft drew after they were already sold. Here's the number that should really stop you for a second. According to endpoint monitoring firm Lansweeper, as of just a few days, AGO, mid-July 2026, Windows 10 still sits at roughly 17% of all Windows devices being tracked. 17% of an installed base that Microsoft itself has said covers over 1.4 billion monthly active devices. Do that math for a second. Even the more conservative estimate puts somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 to 200 plus million machines still running an operating system that, without the ESU program, receives 0 security patches. 0. Not reduced support. 0. And this is where the story stops being a tech story and starts being something closer to a slow-motion, entirely preventable disaster. Because here's the trap, and it's why I'm calling this the June 2026 trap, even though the news itself broke quietly last month. The ESU extension didn't rescue anyone. It just moved the deadline further down the road for the machines that can enroll, while doing absolutely nothing for the underlying 240 million machines that can never, under any circumstances, actually become secure again through a real operating system upgrade. Microsoft essentially handed out an extra year of borrowed time on a countdown clock that was still going to hit 0 eventually, for a huge chunk of the people relying on it. It's not a fix, it's a snooze button. And when that snooze button finally runs out, whether that's October 2027 for consumers or sometime sooner for the businesses on separate enterprise licensing agreements paying escalating fees that start around $61 per device and climb from there. The machines that were never eligible for Windows 11 in the first place don't get a second extension. They just stop being safe to use, permanently. So who actually gets caught in that gap? Not big corporations with IT departments and refresh budgets. It's schools that bought Chromebook-adjacent laptops during the pandemic scramble in 2020 and 2021 and still have them in classrooms right now. It's small businesses running 8 or 10 machines with 0 dedicated tech staff. It's individual families, and especially people in developing economies where the secondhand computer market isn't a niche hobby. It's how most people access a computer at all. I'm going to walk you through exactly how big this crisis actually is, in real numbers, and exactly why just recycle it is a far more toxic, far more literal problem than most people realize. Stick around, because the e-waste numbers alone are going to change how you look at that old laptop sitting in your drawer. Well, let's actually put real numbers on this, because millions of computers is the kind of phrase that gets thrown around so often, it stops meaning anything. So let's slow down and look at what's actually happening on the ground right now in the middle of 2026. Start with the installed base. Microsoft itself has said Windows is running on over 1.4 billion monthly active devices worldwide. As of this month, independent tracking from Landsweeper puts Windows 10's share at roughly 17% of that base. And that's after nearly a full year of Windows 11 crossing the 1 billion user milestone, which Microsoft confirmed happened back in January. So even with all that migration, even with Windows 11 now sitting somewhere north of 70 to 78% of the desktop base, depending on whose tracker you trust, you're still left with well over 100 million. Machines, conservatively, still running an operating system that no longer receives free automatic security protection, unless someone specifically went and enrolled it in the ESU program. And enrollment is not automatic. It requires a Microsoft account. It requires syncing settings. It requires knowing the program exists in the first place. And if you think the average person casually checking their email and browsing Facebook actually knows what extended security updates means, I'd gently push back on that assumption. Now, here's the part that actually explains the title of this video. Of that massive remaining Windows 10 population, Canalys, one of the more frequently cited analyst firms tracking this exact question, estimates that somewhere around 240 million of those devices are hardware incompatible with Windows 11. Haven't upgraded yet, cannot upgrade ever without replacing the physical machine. That's not a rounding error. That's a number larger than the entire population of most countries on Earth, sitting on desks and laps, physically excluded from the one path that would keep them secure long term. So walk through the actual decision tree these people are facing. Option 1, keep using the machine anyway, unpatched, hoping nothing exploits it. Option 2, pay for ESU where eligible. IT staff, no enterprise licensing agreement, no budget line item labeled surprise operating system crisis. For a shop running 8 or 10 machines, this doesn't arrive as a gentle heads up with plenty of runway. It arrives as an unplanned expense at the exact moment when every other operating cost is already climbing. And then there's the demographic that gets talked about the least in all of this coverage. People in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where the secondhand computer market isn't a bargain hunter's hobby. It's the primary way most people get online at all. For them, this isn't an inconvenience. It's the difference between having a secure working connection to the modern internet or not having one at all. Microsoft will point to real, legitimate security reasons thinking behind the TPM 2.0 requirement. And to be fair to them, those reasons aren't fake. Features like secure boot and hardware-backed encryption genuinely do make a system safer. But there's a massive difference between recommending stronger security hardware going forward and retroactively locking out 250 million existing devices whose owners were never told, at the time of purchase, that this cutoff was coming. That's not a security policy, that's a forced disposal cycle, dressed up in security language. And in the next section, I want to break down exactly who's hit hardest by this, and more importantly, exactly what you can actually do about it if your machine is one of the ones on the wrong side of that line. Let's get specific about who actually absorbs the damage here, because this crisis isn't distributed evenly, and pretending it is would be dishonest. Start with schools, because this is one of the clearest, most well-documented cases. During the pandemic, in 2020 and 2021, school districts around the world spent enormous amounts of emergency funding buying laptops so kids could learn from home. That was money well spent at the time. It kept education functioning during a genuinely impossible period. But 5 and 6 years later, a huge share of those exact devices are the ones now sitting on the wrong side of the TPM 2.0 wall. School IT budgets, especially in public systems, are not built to replace entire fleets of hardware on a 5-year cycle just because a software requirement changed. So administrators right now are facing an actual unpleasant choice. Spend money, the district often doesn't have to replace working machines or keep running unpatched systems on networks that also happen to store student records, health information, and family data. Neither option is good, and neither option should have been necessary in the first place. Then there's the healthcare angle, and this one genuinely surprised me when I looked into it. A recent industry report specifically flagged that around 23% of devices in healthcare and pharmaceutical settings are still running Windows 10, much of it unpatched. Think about what's actually stored on those machines: patient records, prescription histories, insurance data, sitting on operating systems that no longer receive automatic security updates unless someone specifically enrolled them in a program most non-IT staff have never heard of. That's not a hypothetical risk. That's a live one right now in July 2026. Small businesses face a version of the same problem without any of the institutional resources. A shop running 8 or 10 computers doesn't have a chief information security officer. It doesn't have a 5-year hardware refresh budget line. For that owner, this deadline doesn't arrive as a calm, well-communicated heads up months in advance. It arrives the way most small business tech emergencies arrive. Suddenly, expensively, and usually at the worst possible time. And then there's the group that I think gets talked about the least in mainstream tech coverage, even though it's arguably the largest group affected: individual users in developing economies. Across South Asia, Southeast Asia, much of Africa, and Latin America, the secondhand computer market isn't a niche corner of the tech world. It's the primary on-ramp to owning a computer at all. People buying 3, 4, 5-year-old machines because new hardware is simply out of financial reach. For them, this isn't an inconvenience wrapped in a software update prompt. It's a decision made by one of the wealthiest companies in the world that quietly determines whether or not they get to keep participating safely in the modern internet at all. And they had zero say in that decision. I want to be fair to Microsoft here because good journalism means representing both sides honestly, not just building the most dramatic version of the story. Microsoft's public position is that TPM 2.0 and the newer processor requirements exist for real security reasons: hardware-backed encryption, secure boot, protection against the kind of firmware-level attacks that pure software patches genuinely can't fix. And that's true. Those protections are meaningfully better than what older hardware can offer. The problem isn't that the security reasoning is fake. The problem is the retroactive part, locking out 250 million already purchased devices, whose owners were never told at checkout that a hardware clock was quietly running out on them. So, practically, if you're one of the people affected, and given the numbers we just walked through, there's a real chance you are. Here's what actually works right now in the middle of 2026, based on what I've dug into across multiple sources. Linux is the strongest option for most people, and it's improved dramatically. Distributions like Linux Mint, Ubuntu, and Zorin OS runs smoothly on hardware that Windows 11 outright refuses. None of them require TPM 2.0. None of them have an arbitrary hardware age cutoff. Zorin OS specifically was designed to feel familiar to people coming from a Windows background, which makes the learning curve far gentler than most people expect. If your daily use is mostly browsing, email, documents, and video calls, Linux handles every bit of that, securely, for free. Chrome OS Flex is the second real option, especially for browser-centric users. It's Google's free operating system built specifically to give older hardware a legitimate second life. And for a lot of people whose entire workflow already lives inside a browser tab anyway, it can genuinely feel like a faster, cleaner experience than the aging Windows install it replaces. If you want to stay inside the Windows ecosystem specifically, certified refurbished laptops and desktops with Windows 11 eligible processors are widely available now at prices well below retail. A legitimate middle path if a full platform switch feels like too much. And there's a fourth option worth knowing exists, even though it's unofficial. Community tools like Rufus allow Windows 11 to be installed on hardware that doesn't technically meet Microsoft's stated requirements. Microsoft is aware this workaround exists and hasn't blocked it outright. It's not officially supported, and it's not for everyone, but for technically confident users who want to stay on Windows without buying new hardware. It's a real working path that a lot of people have quietly been using for over a year now. None of these fixes the structural problem, though. They're individual escape hatches for individual users who happen to hear about them, which is exactly why most of the 240 million affected machines won't take any of these paths at all. They'll just keep running unpatched until they eventually get thrown away. And that's the part of this story I want to close on because it's the part almost nobody's actually talking about, honestly. So here's where all of this actually lands. And I want to bring it back to the number that should be the headline of every tech news segment covering this, instead of a quiet footnote buried at the bottom of a support page. Roughly 240 million two computers on this planet, according to Canalys, are hardware incompatible with Windows 11, permanently, structurally, with no software patch that will ever fix it. And whether Microsoft extends the free security update window to October 2026 or October 2027, or even further out than that, none of those extensions actually solve the underlying problem for those specific machines. They just push the moment of reckoning further down the calendar. Eventually, that clock runs out for good, and when it does, those machines don't get another extension because there isn't a version of Windows they're allowed to run next. That's the trap. Not one single date. a slow closing door that a lot of people don't even realize they're standing in front of. And I want to be honest about something because I think it makes this whole story more credible, not less. The panic around a hard June 2026 cliff that a lot of tech content pushed earlier this year didn't play out exactly the way it was originally framed. Microsoft quietly extended free consumer coverage out to October 2027 back in late June, and that genuinely bought real breathing room for a huge number of people. That's a fact, and pretending otherwise wouldn't be fair reporting. But breathing room isn't the same thing as a solution. For the 240 million machines that were never eligible for Windows 11 in the first place, an extended deadline is just a longer runway toward the exact same wall. The music hasn't stopped yet, but it's still going to stop. Here's a question I'd genuinely like you to answer honestly in the comments right now before you do anything else. Do you know, off the top of your head, whether the laptop or desktop you're using right now can actually run Windows 11? Not probably. It's a few years old, so I assume so. Do you actually know? If you don't, that's worth 5 minutes of your time today, because Microsoft has a free PC health check tool that tells you instantly. If the answer comes back no, you now have real information instead of a guess. And real information is what lets you make a decision on your own timeline instead of Microsoft's. And if it turns out your machine is one of the affected ones, please don't let this turn into a, well, I'll deal with it eventually situation, because that's exactly the mindset that turns a fixable problem into a landfill statistic 2 or 3 years from now. Look at the actual options we walked through. Linux distributions like Mint or Zorin OS that are genuinely beginner-friendly now, Chrome OS Flex if your life lives mostly in a browser, refurbished Windows 11 eligible hardware if you want to stay in.